In Resident Evil 2, there's an orphanage on the outskirts of Raccoon City. The files you find there mention children being taken somewhere for special treatment. Most players assumed it was just environmental storytelling, another piece of Umbrella's cruelty scattered across the city. But in Resident Evil 9, we learn where those children went. Beneath Raccoon City, in a facility called ARC that was operating during and after the 1998 outbreak, Oswell Spencer was running experiments on orphans, not to create bioweapons, not to test viruses, but to find something else entirely, something he believed could justify 30 years of atrocity. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the full story of what Spencer was really doing beneath Raccoon City, the orphanage, the children taken to ARC, what the experiments were actually for, and why one of those children, a girl Spencer named his Hope, would become the key to everything 30 years later. This is deeply disturbing. This is clinically detailed. And this is what Umbrella was hiding under the city they destroyed. The orphanage located directly above the Advanced Research Knot was far more than a simple neighboring building, because it functioned as the facility's literal respiratory system. Positioned with clinical precision, the orphanage provided a public front that masked the industrial scale of the operations beneath the earth. While public records showed a legitimate care facility supported by Umbrella's charitable wing, the sublevels were built to process a population that would never appear on a city census. It is a site where the sounds of a nursery were used to hide the mechanical reality of a subterranean research complex. Evidence suggests, though never confirms, that the orphanage provided a human heat signature and constant logistical movement to mask the ARC's massive power consumption. Many believe this points toward a deliberate architectural choice to blend the facility's ventilation requirements into the background noise of an urban care facility. This placement allowed Umbrella to maintain a visible, philanthropic presence while hiding the industrial footprints of their viral research. The orphanage was the essential camouflage, a social shield that discouraged outside investigation for years. This strategy follows a documented franchise pattern, where Umbrella used the perceived sanctity of care to hide a total absence of oversight. From the Raccoon City orphanage to other medical fronts, the corporation created a protective layer of trust to mask their biological activities. By operating under the guise of philanthropy, the organization ensured that any disappearances would be handled by their own internal bureaucracy. The orphanage was the first layer of a system designed to make the procurement of human subjects administratively clean and invisible to the public. The gap between the public files and the industrial architecture below reveals the depth of this institutional deception. While visitors saw a functioning care facility, the sublevels were designed for the long-term processing of subjects who were often categorized with total clinical detachment. The paperwork was designed to be as invisible as the children it claimed to protect, creating a trail of data that satisfied regulators without ever revealing the true nature of the research. It was a facility where the light of the upper floors was the only thing the world was ever meant to see. One reading of this design is that the building was never intended to be a home, but rather a filtration system for human assets. While a standard laboratory might attract suspicion for its logistical needs, a care home with a high turnover of residents can explain away a significant portion of its footprint. It is possible that the building was maintained as a biological mask that could be defended indefinitely through legal and charitable status. The orphanage was the perfect cover because it was the one institution that nobody in the community felt they had the right to question. Ultimately, the Ark's location beneath the orphanage represents the darkest legacy of the 1998 era. It shows a corporation that had successfully turned a sanctuary into a procurement front, and by the time anyone realized the discrepancy between the building's public function and its subterranean reality, the city was already facing destruction. The facility was a testament to the idea that the most effective way to hide a monster is to place it directly beneath a nursery, ensuring that the truth is buried under layers of institutional trust. The population targeted for research beneath the orphanage was chosen for their lack of a social and bureaucratic infrastructure. The confirmed law states that children were raised at this facility specifically as candidates for viral weapons research, where they were subjected to constant injections and medical tests. These individuals were often those who existed on the margins of society, lacking the advocates necessary to question their sudden relocation or their treatment. To a research program requiring a high volume of stable biological data, this vulnerable population represented a renewable and quiet resource. Many in the community suggest that the care system of the late 20th century created the ideal conditions for this kind of procurement. While a child vanishing from a prominent family would trigger a massive investigation, a child transferred between two umbrella-funded facilities could be handled as a mere administrative update. One reading of the files is that the subjects were chosen because they were effectively invisible before they ever stepped foot in a lab. This allowed Umbrella to maintain a self-contained ecosystem of research that operated entirely outside the view of the law. The difference in institutional response is the core of this tragedy. Some fans speculate that the specific focus on undocumented or orphaned children allowed Umbrella's financial and political reach to keep the records sparse. Because these children lacked a paper trail in the outside world, their history could be easily rewritten or erased by a single signature. It is theorized that Umbrella functioned as its own regulatory body in these regions, ensuring that the paperwork stayed clean even as the subjects were being processed for the ELPIS project. Children without advocates are seen as the most dangerous kind of secret, because their silence is guaranteed by their isolation. The researchers at the ORK understood that by cutting these subjects off from any family infrastructure, they were creating a pool of genetic data that could be harvested without risk. The children were not viewed as human beings, but as candidates for viral integration, their lives reduced to a series of trial numbers and reaction charts. This clinical detachment is the defining feature of the orphanage's procurement history. How Umbrella maintained this clean paperwork for decades is a point of intense analysis for those who study the series. It is plausible that the corporation used its charitable wing to actively seek out children who had no other options, presenting the Ark as a place of medical opportunity. Once inside, these candidates were subjected to the reality of the Epsilon strain, while the records upstairs showed only a routine cycle of care. It was a system where the most vulnerable were turned into the foundation of a global biological nightmare. Reflecting on this population, the horror comes from the realization that their anonymity was a tactical asset for Spencer. They were the invisible victims of a war for the future of the human genome. By the time the events of Requiem begin, the legacy of these children is found only in the numbered subject files and the broken prototypes they left behind. They were chosen because they were the ones the world would not look for, a fact that allowed the Ark to breathe through the silence of the orphans. The transition from the orphanage to the sub-levels marks a definitive shift in design language and intent. While the upper floors utilized a domestic aesthetic to satisfy donors and inspectors, the floors below were built with the brutalist efficiency required for high-level viral containment. This separation ensured that the children who were visible to the public would never see the reality of the facility's true function. Many believe the sub-level transition featured a clinical shift toward reinforced materials and decontamination protocols, though the specific architectural details remain a matter of thematic interpretation. The architecture reveals that the children were no longer residents once they reached the lower corridors. They were subjects of long-term biological study. The physical layout was a studied attempt to hide the movement of these subjects, utilizing service corridors and internal elevators to ensure they never left a visible trail on the orphanage's main floors. The Ark, as a facility beneath the orphanage, represents the intersection of Umbrella's public mask and its private abattoir. What a facility designed to process human subjects looks like is revealed in the isolation cells and the observation rooms that line the lower hallways. These spaces were focused on data collection and the management of candidates for Project Elpis. One reading of the facility's design is that the lower levels were built to be functionally invisible, even to the people living directly above them in the dormitories. The sub-levels also housed the technical infrastructure needed to sustain a massive research complex deep underground. It is possible that the cooling and filtration systems were integrated into the orphanage's plumbing to further mask the industrial scale of the lab. This integrated design allowed the laboratory's power and ventilation needs to be hidden within the utility footprint of a large care home. The architecture was not just a container for the science, but a primary tool of the cover story that allowed the Ark to remain undetected for years. The deliberate separation of these two worlds created a dual reality that defined the daily life of the facility. Above, the domestic decor was maintained to satisfy the eyes of the community. Below, the clinical reality of the Epsilon strain was the only law. Many in the community interpret this as the ultimate manifestation of Umbrella's institutional evil. The building was a structure that allowed the most horrific research in Raccoon City to exist behind a veneer of childhood innocence, she proving that the corporation's best defense was a well-crafted facade. The architecture of the sub-levels is the definitive evidence of the facility's intent. When you strip away the warm tones of the upper floors, you are left with the cold geometry of a biological factory. The sub-levels were built to archive the human spirit, a place where the residents of the orphanage were transformed into data points. The transition from the dormitories to the labs represents the point where the human being is discarded in favor of the prototype, a transition that Grace Ashcroft would eventually have to navigate. The access to Project Elpis required a specific vocal password, rather than a genetic scan or a biometric handshake. For decades, Oswell E. Spencer had been obsessed with the potential for viral integration through the Wesker children, but the confirmed lore suggests his final project relied on something simpler and more human. Elpis is locked in a high-tech vault beneath the ruins that can only be released by a password that only Grace knows. This choice reflects a dying man's desire to lock his final atonement behind a human word that required a specific emotional context to unlock. Grace Ashcroft was the one chosen for this role, not because of her master key DNA, but because she was the one Spencer trusted to carry the memory. While many in the community speculate that he was looking for a specific genomic stability to anchor the epsilon strain, the game emphasizes that Grace was the foundling he considered his hope. The selection criteria that led to Grace being given to Alyssa Ashcroft was an administrative and ideological choice. Spencer needed someone who would grow up honest and away from the science, believing that this isolation would make her the only reliable guardian of the password. The tabula rasa framing, treating Grace as a biologically clean slate, is a popular thematic interpretation among fans of the deep lore. It is possible that Spencer realized his previous subjects were too compromised by viral exposure and sought a child who represented the human race before the pharmaceutical era. This would explain why he went to such lengths to ensure Grace remained a civilian. He wasn't looking for a better monster. He was looking for a person whose mind and body hadn't been touched by the industry. Grace was the outlier in a program that had spent decades corrupting the human genome. The files in the ARC suggest that the selection process was a long and cold evaluation of hundreds of candidates. For every Grace who was allowed to live a normal life, many others were processed as candidates for viral weapons research. The clinical detachment of this process is what makes the orphanage history so disturbing. Spencer viewed the children as genomic variables, testing their reactions to various antigens to find the one who could serve as his legacy. Grace was the successful result of this 3-decade trial, the one who was meant to decide when the world was ready to be reset. The vocal password, hope, is the definitive evidence that Spencer's endgame was rooted in emotional synthesis rather than mechanical security. By the time he reached the end of his life, he had moved away from the cold science of DNA keys toward the power of memory. He believed that the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft would arrive at the answer through her own grief and her connection to her mother. It is a moment of pure agency in a world defined by control. She's showing that the most important moment in the franchise requires no biometric scan, only the recognition of a human word. One reading of this selection process is that Spencer was attempting a personal atonement through Grace. By giving her to the reporter who survived Raccoon City, he was placing his final secret in the hands of the one person he knew would value truth over power. The selection was an act of tactical trust, ensuring that the cure could not be stolen by the board of directors. Grace was the password because she was the only part of Spencer's world that was allowed to stay human. In the playable flashback sequences of Resident Evil Requiem, the background is populated by young girls who bear a striking resemblance to Grace Ashcroft. These figures appear as blurred, unnamed children moving through the sub-levels, creating a state of visceral, psychological dread for the player. While some in the community have suggested designations like Sample 44 to describe them, the game itself keeps them anonymous to reflect the clinical erasure practiced by the researchers. These girls represent the collective history of the orphanage, a population of candidates who were processed while the search for hope continued. The resemblance between these girls and Grace is one of the most disturbing revelations in the arc. Many in the community interpret this as evidence of an early cloning or sister program, where multiple candidates were raised under similar conditions to find the one who could anchor the project. The flashback sequences force the player to acknowledge the scale of the operation, showing a corridor filled with identical uniforms and silenced identities. By withholding their names, the game highlights how the researchers viewed these children as disposable husks rather than human beings. The detail of the grey smocks worn by the girls is a widely noted visual cue, though its specific meaning remains a matter of thematic interpretation. Some believe the identical clothing was a tool used to strip away individuality and ensure the subjects were treated with total detachment. In the flashbacks, these smocks become the uniform of the erased, a visual reminder that for every success like Grace, there were many who were reduced to a trial number. The game shows you enough to understand the scale of the atrocity without ever confirming the specific fate of each child in plain language. What the research team's documentation reveals is a total lack of empathy for the subjects in their care. The girls in the flashbacks are treated as data points in the long-term study of the Epsilon strain, their health and their reactions monitored by a system that had no interest in their future. The community often points toward these sequences as the most effective horror in the game, as they represent the silence of a system that archives people. The unnamed girls are the evidence of the process that produced Grace, the failed candidates whose lives were the cost of Spencer's final project. The absence of ages and names in the ARC files is the definitive proof of institutional evil. It shows a facility that had successfully turned human procurement into a piece of industrial logistics. The girls in the flashbacks are the ghosts in the machine, the ones who were evaluated and processed while the world looked the other way. By populating the memory sequences with these figures, Capcom reminds the player that the biological nightmare was built on the backs of those who had no voice. They are the silent witnesses to the pharmaceutical myth. The unnamed girls serve as a psychological anchor for Grace's own journey. When she sees these figures in her memory, she is forced to confront the reality that she was not just an orphan, but a candidate in a biological lottery. The horror comes from the realization that she could have easily been one of the girls in the grey smocks, erased and forgotten by the paperwork. The flashback sequences are a requiem for those who were not chosen, a reminder that the hope Spencer created was born from the suffering of an entire population of invisible children. The game maintains a chilling silence regarding the ultimate fate of the children who were not selected for Project Elpis. While Grace was given a life of obscurity under Alyssa's care, the standard procedure for the non-viable candidates is left in a state of terminal shadow. Many in the community suggest that the children who failed the screening were not simply returned to the orphanage above, as doing so would risk the facility's absolute secrecy. Instead, the evidence points toward a much darker method of disposal that allowed Umbrella to maintain its clean, administrative record. Speculation regarding these outcomes often focuses on the incinerators found in the lower sublevels of the ARC. While the game avoids using explicit names for these disposal logs, the physical presence of organic waste systems suggests a clinical approach to medical refuse. One reading of the silence is that the subjects who were no longer useful were eliminated with the same detachment as lab equipment. This policy ensured that there were never any witnesses left to describe the reality of the sub-level experiments, making the disappearances permanent and administratively clean. The pattern of Umbrella facilities across the franchise confirms that official records rarely account for the full subject population. From the labs beneath Raccoon City to the Baker estate, there were always more subjects than names. It is theorized that the standard procedure at the ARK involved repurposing failed candidates as base stock for the cultivation of other bioweapons. In this view, the children who were not chosen to be Spencer's hope were instead used to fuel the industry of his destruction. The corporation never wasted a biological resource, even if that resource was a child. The implication that Grace was an administrative exception is what makes her origin so tragic. She was the one who was allowed to leave the slaughterhouse because she was too valuable to be discarded. For the hundreds of other girls who resembled her, the standard outcome was total erasure. They were the rule of the Umbrella Corporation, a population that was consumed by the industry it was meant to serve. The silence of the failures is the definitive evidence of the institutional evil that allowed the Ark to operate for decades without a single public outcry. Many believe this points toward a culture of total compliance among the researchers at the orphanage. To maintain the Hope Project, they had to accept the clinical termination of those who didn't meet the criteria. This administrative murder was just another part of the quarterly logistics, a task that required the same lack of empathy as a blood draw or a genetic test. The failures were the collateral damage of a eugenics project that sought a perfect reset for a world that Spencer had already broken. Ultimately, what happened to the children who were not selected is the most disturbing question the game leaves for the player. By refusing to answer it in plain language, the narrative forces us to confront the darkest implications of the pharmaceutical era. The incinerators and the silence are the final words in the stories of the unnamed girls. Grace Ashcroft is the only one who can tell their story now, as she is the only success to come out of a system that produced hundreds of ghosts. The standard outcome was the void, and Grace is the only one who escaped it. The discovery of Emily as Subject 171 is the pivot point that reveals the true scale of the Connection's industrial operation. A 3-digit catalogue number confirms that this was not a small-scale experiment, but a factory. If Emily is designated as 171, it implies that a minimum of 170 other subjects preceded her in this specific cycle alone. The bureaucratic precision of the numbering proves that the methodology of child exploitation didn't die with Umbrella in 2003. It was simply refined and commercialized by the syndicates that rose from its ashes. Many in the community interpret this number as a sequential position in a subject registry, suggesting a program that has been churning through biological hosts for decades. What a facility that numbers its subjects in the triple digits reveals is a level of demand that exceeds any single person's vision. The program was no longer about Spencer's personal atonement. It had become a self-sustaining industrial appetite for genomic intelligence. Emily is the latest data point in a long history of biological commodification, a child who represents the industrialization of the human genome. The bureaucratic horror of such a system lies in its permanence. The documentation style at Rhodes Hill mirrors the original ARK methodology, confirming that the system of child exploitation is more durable than any single corporation. The syndicates did not invent these protocols. They simply inherited the paperwork and scaled it. Gideon was merely the latest manager of a project that has been cataloging children as proprietary assets since the 1990s. Emily's 3-digit designation is a chilling confirmation that the bioweapons industry has become an automated machine of suffering. The numbering suggests a factory-like throughput where subjects are processed, tested, and discarded once their data is harvested. This clinical framing is the definitive evidence of the institutional evil that allows these organizations to exist. Emily is not a person in the files. She is a numbered failure, a piece of proprietary technology that didn't meet the required genomic specifications. The scale of the program is the ultimate horror. a factory that produces failure on a triple-digit scale in the pursuit of a single biological success. The numbering system also provides a glimpse into the efficiency of the harvest. If Emily is only a few years old and is already number 171, the rate of disposal in the program is exceptionally high. This suggests that the accelerated growth process used by the connections is both lethal and inefficient, requiring a constant supply of new biological hosts to maintain the research. Emily is the survivor of a process that has likely claimed hundreds of lives before her designation serving as a monument to those who were processed and forgotten in the pursuit of the master key. Subject 171 is the physical proof that the war against the virus was never won. It was just commercialized. The system that authorized the ARK is still active, still numbering its victims, and still operating behind a mask of medical care. The scale revealed by the catalog number is a reminder that the monsters of the franchise are not just in the labs, but in the paperwork that allows the labs to exist. Emily's existence is the definitive evidence that the pharmaceutical myth has evolved into a more permanent and industrial form of biological slavery. Emily is the confirmed, failed prototype of the Elpis lineage, a child who represents the physical and psychological toll of the cloning program. In the Rhodes Hill medical records, the term failed is used clinically to describe her condition. She is blind, hypersensitive to light, and emotionally stunted. Each attempt in this program required a fresh biological host or a high-grade incubation tank, turning the act of reproduction into an industrial process. Emily is the living evidence of the cruelty required to manufacture a perfect human, a prototype that was broken by the very process that created her. The word failed at a biological level refers to the catastrophic cellular and neurological deficiencies caused by the accelerated growth process. To achieve the specific genomic signature of Grace Ashcroft, the connections had to force the human genome to mature at a rate it cannot sustain. This result is a body that is functionally incomplete, where the eyes and the mind are sacrificed to satisfy a corporate requirement for genomic purity. Emily is a child who has never once been allowed to simply be a person, because her very existence was designed to be a data harvest for the biodefense apparatus. How many iterations a program typically produces before arriving at a failure in the triple digits is a question that haunts the law. It suggests a history of hundreds of discarded attempts, children who were born in a tank and died in a lab without ever seeing the sun. The horror of the clinical language applied to Emily is that it treats her suffering as a mere technical hurdle to be overcome in the next iteration. She is the template for industrial replication, a girl who was engineered to be a biological instrument and ended up as a broken prototype in a hospital bed. The cloning program represents the ultimate escalation of the industry's hubris. They are no longer just infecting people. They are trying to program the human zygote to serve their tactical needs. Emily's condition shows that the connections have not yet mastered the stability of the Ashcroft line, but it also shows they are willing to produce an infinite number of failures to find the one success. This industrial approach to life is the defining horror of the modern era, where a child's history is replaced by a laboratory log and a catalogue number. The medical records describing Emily as emotionless are particularly disturbing. It is possible that this was a deliberate design choice by Gideon to ensure the subject was easier to manage, or it may have been a natural side effect of the total lack of human contact during her development. One reading of this detail is that the program sought to strip away the soul of the child along with her identity. Emily is a girl who has been denied the most basic human experiences to satisfy a corporate requirement for genomic purity. She is the physical manifestation of a science that has lost its humanity. Ultimately, the cloning program proves that the legacy of Spencer has been scaled into a global business model. The failed attempts are the collateral damage of a commercial operation that views the human race as a renewable resource for data. Emily's survival and her subsequent rescue by Grace are the only things that break this clinical cycle. She is the living proof that the failed prototype is still a person with a right to exist beyond the spreadsheets. The horror of the program is its scale, but the hope of the mission is the girl who was finally given a name and a future. The Connections Syndicate inherited Spencer's child subject methodology after his death and successfully scaled it into a global commercial operation. There is a distinct ideological difference between Spencer's eugenicist motivation and the purely transactional approach of the Connections. While Spencer sought a god-like evolution of the species, the new architects of the program see children as mere proprietary assets to be sold to the highest bidder. Rhodes Hill is the sanitized, medically credentialed version of the ARC sublevels, utilizing the same function, but with significantly better public relations and branding. What it means that this program survived the death of its founder and the collapse of Umbrella is a point of deep institutional horror. It suggests that the appetite for human subject research is not tied to a single corporation, but is a permanent part of the biodefense infrastructure. Rhodes Hill looks like a high-end private hospital, but beneath the modern facade, the methodology is identical to the 1998 laboratories. The Connections have successfully normalized the commodification of children, turning the nightmare of the RRK into a sustainable business model that operates in the light of day. This transition from secret bunker to private clinic reveals how the industry has adapted to 30 years of international oversight. By hiding their research behind a shield of medical care and charitable outreach, the Connections have made the program nearly impossible to dismantle through traditional means. Many in the community interpret this as the ultimate victory of the pharmaceutical myth, where the atrocity is hidden in plain sight. Rhodes Hill is a factory for the future, a site where the genomic secrets of the past are being refined for a new generation of buyers. The implication is that this was never solely one man's project, but an institutional appetite that predates Spencer entirely. The eugenics societies of the 19th century provided the ideological blueprint that Umbrella and the Connections would later follow. By branding themselves as a chronic care center, the syndicate provides a layer of legal authority that allows them to maintain total control over their subjects. It is the same program, just with a new set of signatures on the clipboards. The children at Rhodes Hill are the modern victims of an ancient desire to control the human genome. The Connections replaced the God complex of the old guard with the clinical detachment of a board of directors. They are not interested in creating a master race, and they are interested in the profitability of a stable biological weapon. This shift in motivation makes the program even more dangerous, as it is no longer limited by the whims of a single man. It is a corporate machine that views the human zygote as a piece of software to be programmed and patented. Rhodes Hill is the industrial successor to the Ark, a place where the darkness of the past has been given a clean, white coat of paint. Resident Evil Requiem acts as the definitive connective tissue for a 30-year history of child exploitation within the series. This timeline begins with Lisa Trevor, the first documented child subject in franchise history, whose total erasure from official records established the template for every atrocity that followed. Her fate proved that the corporation could consume a human life entirely, leaving behind nothing but a mutated biological husk. This established the precedent of children being treated as disposable hosts for viral experiments, a theme that has recurred in every major incident since 1998. The Wesker Children Program expanded this methodology by selecting orphans for their genetic potential and subjected them to progressive viral exposure with no informed consent. Unlike Lisa Trevor, these subjects were part of a long-term sociological and biological experiment, highlighting the transition toward engineering the human race. Sherry Birkin represents the most intimate version of this horror, a child used as a vessel for the G virus by her own father. Her survival and her subsequent institutionalization by the government show how the state and the corporations work together to manage the survivors of these child subject programs. The progression continued with Natalia Corda in Resident Evil Revelations 2, whose consciousness was extracted, replicated, and weaponized as a long-term intelligence asset. This marked the point where the industry moved beyond the physical body to target the very mind of the subject. The E-Series program and Eveline represented the shift toward purpose-built weaponry, where a child was engineered from birth to be a biological instrument. Emily is the latest in this lineage, representing the template for industrial replication. She is the proof that the industry has finally mastered the art of manufacturing a human being for data. Grace Ashcroft is the master key that was supposed to resolve this entire timeline. Spencer viewed her as the success that could justify 30 years of failure, the one subject who remained stable enough to anchor his final antigen. The community largely interprets this as a tragic culmination. For one Grace to exist, the entire history of Lisa, Sherry, and Natalia had to occur first. Grace is the product of a 30-year trial and error process that has claimed thousands of young lives. She is the intersection of every experiment the franchise has documented since the Arklay Mountains. The mapping of this timeline reveals that each generation of the bioweapons industry has refined the program rather than abandoning it, from Umbrella to Tricell to the connections. So the methodology has become more intimate and invasive with every iteration. The children have moved from being accidental victims to being purpose-built biological instruments. Emily and Grace are the final act of this 3-decade tragedy, the survivors of a system that has turned the innocence of childhood into a tactical resource. The franchise pattern is clear. The most valuable asset in a viral war is always the one who hasn't yet reached maturity. The horror of the bioweapons industry has evolved from a matter of infection to a matter of total biological engineering. In the 1990s, Lisa Trevor was a girl who caught a virus. In the modern era, Emily is a girl who is the virus. This shift from host to instrument shows that organizations like the Connections have moved beyond observing mutations to actively programming human biology from the zygote stage. The methodology has become more invasive, moving from the injection of pathogens to the full-scale replication of the genome to achieve a proprietary result. Each successive organization has refined the program rather than abandoning it after the previous iteration was exposed. When Umbrella fell, The data and the subjects were simply transferred to new entities, ensuring that the research never stopped. The escalation from physical experimentation to genomic replication and consciousness extraction shows that the industry is constantly crossing the lines that the previous generation drew. The goal is no longer just a better monster, but the total obsolescence of the natural human genome in favor of a managed industrial biology. Emily represents the current peak of this invasive trajectory. What this escalation implies about the future is deeply disturbing. If the cycle is not broken during the events of Requiem, the next version of the program might involve the total digitization of the human spirit. Many in the community believe this points toward a world where the corporation owns the child before they are even born, their genomic data already licensed, and their future already archived. The connections are not just refining a weapon, they are refining a system of absolute biological control. Each generation is more efficient and more cold than the last, turning the act of being human into a technical hurdle. The shift toward engineering purposeful subjects has made the horror more clinical and less accidental. In the early years, the outbreaks were seen as failures of containment. Now, the outbreak is a managed phase of the data harvest. Emily's condition, blind and emotionless, is the documented outcome of a science that prioritized genomic purity over the functional life of the host. The escalation has stripped away any remaining pretense of humanitarian care, revealing the industrial appetite that has been the driving force of the franchise for 30 years. Ultimately, the escalation across generations proves that the bioweapons industry is a self-correcting machine. It learns from its failures and adapts its branding to stay one step ahead of the heroes. The science has become so intimate that it is now inseparable from the life of the subject. Grace and Emily are the final victims of this progression, the two paths of a program that has spent 3 decades trying to manufacture a soul. If the connections are allowed to continue, the next iteration will be even more invasive, moving the horror from the lab into the very definition of humanity. From the Baker Estate to the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Centre, the series has consistently used domestic and care spaces to create a sense of perverted safety. A care home is the structurally ideal cover for a long-term human subject program because it provides built-in isolation and total institutional authority over the residents. When a child is placed behind those walls, the caregiver has absolute legal control over their movements, their medical care, and their records. This allows the researchers to operate a parallel operation beneath the surface of a sanctuary, invisible to the people directly above them. The architecture of these buildings reflects the predatory nature of the organizations that built them. They are designed with hidden crawl spaces, locked wings, and basement laboratories that are separated from the public areas by layers of administrative and physical security. Each facility in the franchise maintains a veneer of legitimacy while running a program that treats the residents as raw material. The specific design choices, the one-way glass, and the staff who are paid not to ask questions ensure that the truth of the facility is only revealed when it is too late to stop the harvest. Many believe this points toward a cynical view of institutional trust. The franchise argues that the people we trust most to care for us are often the ones best positioned to exploit us. The care home front is not just a tactical choice, but a moral statement on the nature of systemic evil. By using the sanctity of a nursery or a hospital to hide a slaughterhouse, Umbrella and its successors demonstrated a total lack of human empathy. The architecture of these buildings is the physical manifestation of the lie that has allowed the bioweapons industry to survive for 3 decades. What this pattern reveals is the institutional appetite that allows these organizations to thrive. They don't just build labs, they build social structures that provide them with a constant supply of subjects. A care home is a procurement front that is sanctioned by the state, making it the perfect environment for a long-term clinical study. The children at the Ark and the patients at Rhodes Hill were all victims of this institutional authority, their lives signed away by a bureaucracy that prioritized data over souls. The caregiver is the ultimate antagonist in this world of managed horror. Ultimately, the recurring use of domestic spaces shows that the nightmare is never far away. It is in the home, the hospital, and the school. The franchise keeps returning to this theme because it is the most effective way to communicate the scale of the corruption. When the institution meant to protect you becomes the entity that archives you, there is no escape. Resident Evil Requiem highlights this pattern one last time, proving that the only way to stop the monsters is to dismantle the paperwork that authorized them in the first place. Evidence suggests that Alyssa Ashcroft's final investigation at the Wrenwood Hotel was connected to the orphanage records rather than solely to the Ark facility. Her confirmed 2016 report on the Dulvey Parish disappearances serves as evidence that she was already tracking the pattern of children vanishing from care facilities. Many in the community interpret this as the moment she began to connect the facility locations to missing persons records for minors. She likely realized that the children being routed through these homes were being sent to the same shadow organizations she had been hunting since 1998. What a journalist with 30 years of Umbrella knowledge would have concluded is a point of intense interest for lore enthusiasts. Alyssa had seen the Raccoon City orphanage firsthand, and she understood the corporation's procurement methodology better than anyone. It is possible that she was gathering the final evidence needed to prove that the current care system was being used as a biological filter. Her murder was likely a cleanup operation, intended to prevent the world from seeing the spreadsheet of names and destinations she had compiled. She was getting too close to the heart of the industrial machine. There is a profound question regarding whether Alyssa knew the complete truth about the process that produced Grace. If she was aware that Grace was a foundling selected from a pool of hundreds, she may have made a deliberate choice to protect her daughter from that knowledge. The interview on the disc suggests a level of maternal shielding that goes beyond professional duty. Alyssa wanted Grace to have a life that was not defined by a laboratory number, and she may have buried her findings to ensure her daughter's psychological survival. She was a reporter who finally chose a person over a story. The implication that her murder was triggered by the orphanage documentation adds a layer of tragic irony to her death. She died at the Wrenwood while trying to meet a whistleblower who could confirm the link between the care homes and the connections. This suggests that the syndicate viewed her investigation into the procurement of children as more dangerous than her knowledge of the Ark itself. You can survive knowing about a lab, but you cannot survive knowing about the spreadsheet of the missing. Alyssa was the only one who had the full picture, and Gideon had to silence her to ensure his harvest could continue. Ultimately, Alyssa's final investigation was the bridge between the 2 generations of the story. She was the one who saw the institutional pattern before anyone else, and she was the one who tried to stop it with the truth. While she didn't live to see the end of the mission, the data she gathered provided Grace with the moral spine needed to dismantle the system. The reporter's work was the essential foundation for the analyst's victory, proving that the truth doesn't stay buried, even when the person who found it is erased. The emotional core of the final act is Grace's realization that she is the success of a program that left hundreds of failures in its wake, discovering that she was selected from a process that also produced subject 171 forces her to confront the architecture of her own existence. She has to learn that her life was conditional, that she passed a test whose failure had consequences the game never fully describes, but implies through the facility's clinical silence. This psychological weight is what transforms her from a technical analyst into a woman of profound moral conviction. Grace's choice to adopt Emily is a direct and conscious rejection of the clinical logic that created them both. She refuses to view Emily as a failed prototype or a data point, choosing instead to see the human being who survived the same system. This act of empathy is the final defeat of Spencer and Gideon's ideology. By becoming a family, the selected candidate and the discarded prototype prove that they are more than their genomic signatures. The two photographs on Grace's desk represent the two paths of the program, now united in a future that the bioweapons industry never intended. Emily represents the physical embodiment of what the program leaves behind, alive, damaged, and completely without context for her own origin. She is the living proof of the cruelty required to manufacture the master key. For Grace, Emily is a permanent reminder of the sisters she never knew she had, the unnamed girls in the grey smocks who were processed and forgotten. Their bond is a requiem for those who didn't survive, a promise that the individual will always be more important than the data. It is the most politically loaded and human image in the entire franchise. Learning that her existence was the goal of a 30-year tragedy changes Grace's relationship with the truth. She is no longer just reporting on a case. She is reporting on herself. The weight of knowing that her blood was paid for with the lives of hundreds of other children is a burden that will likely define the rest of her life. However, it is also what gives her the strength to leak the final report. She knows that she owes it to the girls in the grey smocks to ensure their stories are finally told. Grace is the survivor who refuses to be silent, the one who carries the names of the missing into the light. Grace and Emily are the final bill for Umbrella's legacy. They are the human remainders of a clinical experiment that was supposed to be perfect. By choosing each other, they reclaim their agency from the corporations and the founders who tried to archive them. The analyst and the prototype are no longer subjects. They are a family, and their survival is the ultimate defiance against a world built on lies. The meaning of Grace is the decision to protect the one who was left behind, proving that hope is not a formula, but an act of love. A forensic breakdown of the evidence surrounding the Orphanage program reveals 3 distinct tiers of information. The game explicitly confirms through in-game documents and cutscenes that the Ark was a procurement hub, that Emily is a clone prototype, and that Grace's DNA served as the master key for the Elpis project. These are the hard facts of the crisis, the anchors that the narrative relies on to ground its horror. We see the labs, we read the logs, and we witness the physical reality of the antigen. This is the foundation of the case that Grace eventually presents to the world. However, the game strongly implies a much larger scale of atrocity through the facility layout and the subject numbering system. While never stated in plain language, the evidence suggests a total death toll in the sublevels that numbers in the hundreds. The link between Xeno and the Wesker program is also a point of intense implication. The game shows Xeno losing his Wesker powers after being cured, suggesting he is a surviving subject of the Labert or Wesker lineage. These implications create a sense of vast, institutional shadow that extends far beyond the events of a single game. The specific identities of the girls in the grey smocks are deliberately left in the dark. The game avoids giving them names or faces, because the horror is more effective when you realize they could be anyone. They represent the collective anonymity of the stateless and the undocumented, a population of ghosts who were erased by the administrative process. By withholding this information, Resident Evil Requiem forces the player to confront the reality of systemic erasure. The lack of detail is the most disturbing narrative choice, as it reflects the way the researchers themselves viewed their subjects. Why the game keeps these details dark is a matter of narrative intent. It emphasizes the theme that the most dangerous aspect of Umbrella was not the monsters, but the paperwork that authorized them. If we knew the girls' names, they would be individuals. By keeping them anonymous, the game makes them a tragedy of the system. This clinical silence is a reflection of the bureaucratic evil that allows these organizations to exist. The horror is in what we don't know, the gaps in the records that can never be filled by anyone but the survivors. Ultimately, the three tiers of evidence create a complete picture of a world that has traded its soul for biological data. The confirmed facts provide the proof, the implications provide the scale, and the darkness provides the dread. Grace Ashcroft's mission was to pull as much of this as possible into the light. But even her manifesto acknowledges that some things will stay buried under the ash. The game argues that we must acknowledge the darkness, even when we can't see everything inside it, because the silence is where the monsters are born, and where the archives of the missing are hidden. The ultimate villain in the Resident Evil universe is not the tyrant, the mold, or the nemesis. It is the administrative process that allowed them to be created. The horror of the Ark and the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center is that they were authorized by signatures on clipboards and managed through a series of legal and corporate frameworks. This institutional evil is the darkest theme of the franchise. She is suggesting that the most effective way to destroy the human race is through the slow, systematic erosion of moral oversight. The creatures are just the symptoms of a diseased bureaucracy that values genomic intelligence over life. The difference between a villain you can shoot and a system you cannot is the core challenge of Resident Evil Requiem. Grace and Leon can kill Victor Gideon, but they cannot kill the connections through physical force alone. Dismantling the system requires the use of the very tools the system uses: data, reports, and accountability. This shift in the narrative focus shows that the franchise has matured, acknowledging that the war against bioterrorism is fought in the offices and the boardrooms as much as in the laboratories. The monsters are a product of a spreadsheet, and they will keep coming as long as the paperwork is allowed to stay clean. Why Emily's surviving and being adopted by Grace is the most direct statement on this theme is because it represents a total breakdown of the system's logic. Emily was a numbered asset, a failure to be neutralized by the administrative process. By taking her out of the system and giving her a name, Grace is committing an act of total institutional rebellion. She is proving that a human life cannot be reduced to a data point, no matter how many clipboards say otherwise. Emily's survival is the ultimate middle finger to 30 years of Umbrella's legacy, a victory of the person over the process. The uncomfortable truth the orphanage represents is that we are all complicit in the systems that allow these horrors to exist. The care home front worked because people chose not to look too closely at the institutions they trusted. This institutional pattern is the franchise's most profound warning, just suggesting that the architecture of evil is built on our own desire for convenience and security. The monsters are authorized by our silence and our willingness to believe the public relations of the pharmaceutical giants. The series keeps returning to this theme because it is the most visceral example of how the pharmaceutical myth has become a reality. The storyline of the children beneath Raccoon City signals a new direction for the series. It suggests that the future of Resident Evil will be about the struggle to reclaim human agency from a world of managed biological security. Whether the full history of the Ark's children will ever be confirmed in plain language remains to be seen, but their presence in the lore is a permanent reminder of the cost of institutional trust. Grace Ashcroft has shown the world the paperwork that authorized the monsters, and the world can no longer look away from the children who are left in the dark.